today we have two presentations. You already see them in the screen, the shared video. Those are two from the Open University UK, Rachel and Andy. We will talk about more the inclusive part of design of open online courses. Well, Sean Texler from Wolverhampton will talk more about the community approach. But let me first give you a short introduction about the main issues in this webinar week. If we talk about MOOCs itself, and there are many definitions in MOOCs, but I prefer to have this very elaborated definition is that MOOCs are designed for a large number of participants. So you already see a design issue that you have to take into account that the course is designed for a large number of participants. And further on, that they need to be accessed by anyone, anywhere, and they are open to everyone without entry qualification. And in the first talk by Rachel and Andy, we will mainly focus on the inclusive and accessibility side of open online courses. So they will not focus on the large numbers, but they will focus on the accessibility and the inclusiveness of open online courses. More you have to know that MOOCs are different from, for example, OER, that they are a full course experience and that they are completely online and for free, although some MOOC providers ask money for example, or for a certificate. If you look a little bit about the history of MOOCs, then still the MOOC hype is not over, although in 2012 it was announced the year of the MOOC. And in the early years it was mainly seen as the promise to provide quality education to all. And that's also related to the UNESCO Development Goal number 4. But for the big universities, and we also joined the big platforms, it was also seen as a powerful global marketing tool. But gradually we saw a shift to using MOOCs and open online courses to be incorporated in flexible learning opportunities. And that both for regular students on campus and for adult learners in lifelong learning. And more recently we see that there is a shift to giving credit to pathways of continuous professional development, or even provide nano degrees, micro masters, short degrees, short programs as part of a postgraduate master, or even as part of a bachelor and master degree. So they really become connected to the higher education as not only the dissemination of knowledge, but as also to provide credit for it. In Europe, we see that the offering of open online courses and MOOCs are mainly related to the social dimension. And the social dimension of the higher education system to provide accessible higher education. So that's also the topic Rachel and Andy in a moment. But also the social dimension in social interaction and the community kind of the design of MOOCs. Sean will talk about in a minute, in a half an hour. The main issue here in this overview is that the aims why you are designing a MOOC and developing a MOOC is increasingly becoming diverse, but also the target group becomes less massive and also have very different target groups. It differs if you are designing a MOOC for everyone, or the disabled people, or unemployed people, or targeting professional development, or even companies, etc., or regular students. Therefore, the design issue becomes more and more an important theme to tackle and address on. And that's what we are doing in this webinar week, where we had already 2 webinars, one related to the world of business, and one about how to design for the right target group and to engage with your target group. Today we will have 2 presentations. We will start with Andy and Rachel addressing inclusion and accessibility for about half an hour, and then Sean will continue with the community kind of MOOCs. For this moment, I will give the floor to Rachel and Andy about the first issue. Andy.
Hello, everybody. Just get our presentation up. Welcome. So, as Darko's already said, myself and Rachel will be giving this particular part of the webinar. We're talking about addressing inclusion and accessibility in open online courses. And although this webinar series is about MOOCs, in this talk we're deliberately talking about the OU's approach to inclusion and accessibility in its online courses. We're going to both talk about our open entry courses for fee-paying taught students and also those published as openly licensed online courses that are free to study, what we might recognise as MOOCs as described by Darko. So we're deliberately going to do that because we think it sets up what are some of the requirements, the different types of requirements that might be needed when producing courses for different audiences, as Darko has already mentioned. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just giving some context, and then Rachel will go into talking about some of the more detailed ways about how we go about doing this. So if we can just So of course, there are many potential barriers to online courses. There's what histories, traditions, the upbringing that people have, give them different types of expectations in terms of their ability to learn. When there's cultural ones, obviously if you're studying from a different culture, you might misunderstand particular cultural norms. For some students, it can be not understanding the cultural norms of a university. There's also issues of people studying the second or third language, but then there's those issues of dyslexia, people who have issues with being able to read material online or on print. And there can even be things about confidence, self-esteem. And so communities coming from those with multiple deprivations, low socioeconomic status, they just may not value education, and that can influence how people think about and how they will engage with education, even if it's freely available to them. But of course, there's also those who have particular locomotor or other physical and mental health characteristics, which influence where and how they can study effectively and efficiently, require assistive technologies. So there's a wide range of things to take into in terms of inclusivity. So it's inclusion of people as well as dealing with those with particular needs. So I'm just talking about the UK here, but you'll probably be familiar with similar figures in your own countries or elsewhere. In the UK, as it says there, about 11 million in the UK with a limiting long-term illness, impairment or disability. It's 2014 figures, and 7% of UK undergraduates in receipt of what's called the Disabled Students Allowance, which you can get. But in the UK, 3 times more disabled students have no formal qualifications compared to non-disabled students. So it's obvious that they are not accessing and not getting the benefit of education as much as those without disabilities. But we also have those issues about people from disadvantaged backgrounds suffering multiple deprivations. As I say there, about 15% of higher education students in the UK come from that area. And all these types of things can affect the attainment gap. That's the sort of gap between those who have none of these disabilities, none of these deprivations, the way they'll be able to perform in education, as opposed to those who do have them. They're doing less well. So this is where the inclusion and the accessibility overlap and are important things to be covered. Now, one of the things we need to remember here, well, certainly it's in the UK, and I'm sure it is where you are, that there are treaties and laws which influence how we need to deal with people with disabilities and things. So the UK Equality Act is the one in the UK that we work with, but it's sort of based on what's come through the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These things cover a lot of areas, including education. So in the UK, as it says there, we have to make a reasonable adjustment to make sure disabled students are not discriminated against. And it says that could be through specialist teachers or equipment or extra support aids, but of course, when designing a course, you can think about how you can design out some of these barriers, some of these issues. And when it talks about making reasonable adjustments, this is in terms of making reasonable adjustments in terms of the cost of doing so for the people it will benefit. And this is where you'll see this is a difference that can come through with those online courses which might be for taught students, fee-paying students, as opposed to online courses. There can be these differences. So certainly there's this duty to provide reasonable adjustments, but as a quality assurance agency, in their quality code says in the UK, it specifically says education providers should offer disabled students learning opportunities which are accessible to them by inclusive design wherever possible and individual adjustments wherever necessary. So there's this element of both a statutory obligation but also a certain amount of moral obligation to doing this. And at the bottom of the slide here you can highlight something that's very new, certainly in the UK, but coming out of the EU Web Accessibility Directive, is there's a much greater requirement, statutory requirement again, in terms of making the websites, the online sites, online materials which universities, other education providers have, to make sure that those are also accessible. This is all about digital accessibility. So there's, again, all this is doing is saying that there are both these legislative and moral requirements that we have to think about when coming in and thinking about inclusive design. Now, I thought we wouldn't just talk till to time. I thought we'd just ask you one or two questions. I've given you some details there. I mean, you wouldn't be able to know these, but just have a guess against these two questions. So Lizzie's going to put these two questions up, and so we just want to say, what do you think is the proportion of OU students who declare a disability? I hope you're all voting now.
The answers are coming in. We are at 4 out of 13. Already 5 people answered.
Okay, we've got enough votes in to show the...
Yes, we're almost halfway there.
Okay.
Okay, I will share them with you.
Okay, so that's an interesting split. Obviously not too many people. Most have gone for the 16 to 20%, but most lower. You'll have seen in the previous slide I talked about in the UK, it's about 7% who are eligible for what's called disabled students allowance. Now, in the OU, many do get DSA as well, but we also ask them to say declare a disability. And in fact, it is around about 20% at the moment. So the 16 to 20% is a bit right, but we're sort of moving just between the 16 to 20% and the 21 to 25% amongst our students. So we do have quite a large number of students who declare a disability of various sorts we need to deal with, and we'll talk about those, what those disabilities are in a minute. Perhaps if we can just do the second question now, which was about how many open online courses does the OU offer, do you think? So these are not the ones for students, these are what we might call MOOCs. So do keep voting. There are the stats. Okay, so it's right across the board, but most have gone for the 501, 750, 751 to 1000. again, this is, you're just having a guess here, and it's a bit of a difficult one to say because it depends what year you do it in. A year or two ago, we were just below the 1,000. Now we're just over the 1,000. So again, it depends what the statistic is. But we do have a lot of them. If we go back to the presentation, I go on to the next slide. So I'm just going to finish off with this slide and hand over to Rachel, just to give you something of the scale of things we're talking about. So it says we've got about 125,000 undergraduate and postgraduate students, about 24,000, nearly say 20% of those have declared disabilities, 14,000 receiving help with their fees, 23% live in the 25% most deprived areas in the UK. 50% have low previous qualifications. By that we mean they don't have the relevant high school qualifications that would gain normal entry to other universities. Of course, we provide open education resources, as we all know, and I list a lot of those at the bottom that on Open Learn. There are about 900, you could call them MOOCs. They're all self-study, but not cohort-based, and there's about 6 million visitors to Open Learn each year. We also have versions of them as iBooks on iTunes and ebooks as Kindle on Amazon. And then the Open University has FutureLearn as a company, which many institutions run MOOCs on. We have about 100 MOOC presentations a year and about 400,000 enrollees on there. So you can see it makes up to about the 1,000. Of course, those MOOCs on FutureLearn are scheduled ones where there's a cohort of students going through. So again, I just talk about that distinction between the MOOCs that are on Open Learn, which people can study at any time at their own pace. There's not a particular cohort there, and the MOOCs on FutureLearn, which are cohort based. So now I'm going to move on and hand over to Rachel.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? If Lizzie could just pop up a message if you can hear me. And just a reminder to everybody that if you have any questions as we're going along, do pop them in the chat box, and Andy's going to keep an eye on that while I'm chatting to you. One of my hats that I wear while I was working at the OU is as an accessibility coordinator, and thanks to Andy for giving us some of the context about the OU's approach to inclusion and accessibility. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the detail of what we do. Andy's already mentioned the statutory context and the legal responsibilities that we have, but I would say that that's really only one kind of driver, and that actually at the OU it's core. Being accessible and inclusive is core to what we do. It's at the heart of what we do. Our mission is to be open to people, places, methods and ideas. And I think that will be familiar to a few of you here today, because I was at Marilese's session yesterday, and I know some of you are from OU, in different countries, and also been based at the OU in the UK. So, but it's this message about being open to people that's at the core of what we do, and that's all people. So regardless of, as Andy has said, regardless of previous education, regardless of backgrounds, of needs and location. And it's very much about not just our MOOCs and free courses that have a kind of global reach. A lot of our fee-paying courses now are what I'll call more formal learning for students. A lot of those courses also have a global reach. And as well as that, we also have students who are in secure environments as well. So we have around 1,500 prisoners currently studying with the OU and working their way towards a degree. So there's lots of challenges that raises as well in terms of accessibility. And in order to kind of promote this and embed this in the culture of what we do, the OU has institutional kind of guidance and policies that help to do that. They can often be a long time in the making. So we have finally now got a student-facing accessibility policy. We are still working on how we implement that. But these policies and guidance are very useful, I think, in helping develop a kind of institutional culture. The student accessibility policy is based on a social model of disability, so that's very much about us being proactive and anticipatory in removing possible barriers or potential barriers, and where we're not able to do that, to make sure that we've got an effective responsive process in place. So if students come to us with requests for adjustments, that we have a very clear process and means of kind of providing that. And I think it's fair to say that the OU's got a long history of supporting disabled students. So, I think we are moving now towards a realisation and a more growing awareness that inclusivity is everyone's responsibility who works in the OU. It's not just down to specialist teams. And I think we are starting to see that kind of shift happening. But we do also have lots of dedicated teams that offer advice and about registration, also in designing courses, producing and delivering courses, and a lot of kind of personal support that I'll come on to in a minute. And I think that's all helped the OU to achieve the disability standard. So in 2016 we were awarded a Bronze Disability Standard from the Business Disability Forum. We're hoping to up that to a silver standard, but when that was awarded back in 2016, we were one of only 2 universities in the UK to achieve that standard. So just thinking about, as Andy said, we're talking generally about our approach. So this includes our kind of more formal learning, but also our MOOCs and free courses. And this is a screenshot of the disability support. This is what inquirers, when deciding, so potential students, they've not yet signed up, might be looking to see how we support them. And it's just to give you an example of the kind of types of support that we offer. So it's not just about making sure our kind of content and materials is accessible. It goes much broader than that, and we help students with accessing funding. So Andy's mentioned the Disabled Students Allowance. We also offer advice on using specialist equipment, and we can provide loans for equipment. We look at, increasingly we're doing standard adjustments, which I'll come on to, but also bespoke adjustments, and we can look at supporting students at tutorials and residential schools and that kinds of thing. And when a student registers with the OU, they'll they complete a form that details their needs and the adjustments that they'll require for their study, and that kind of profile then follows them through their studies. So it's a way that different modules are aware of what those students' needs are. And I think, as I say, this screenshot here is for students that are looking at making a decision whether the OU is for them, and you can see we offer these kind of downloadable booklets on different types of disabilities, so students can see, you know, in advance what support is on offer to them. And it's not just students, obviously, that get that support. So we have lots of guidance and support for our tutors, the ones that have the direct contact with the students. And again, that's just a screenshot from one of the tutors' sites. And you can see there that it goes far beyond disability. So again, bringing it back to this point of inclusion, we have advice for tutors who are supporting new students who might be lacking in confidence, or students whose English might be a second or third language, or students who might be vulnerable, and prison students there, like I said. So it gives you a kind of flavour of the kind of inclusive support that's available for tutors. And then, as well as this kind of personal support that we provide, there is also the kind of, obviously, the technical context as well, in terms of the design requirements for making websites accessible. And this applies to our formal courses and our kind of free and MOOC type courses too. So the OU has its own set of web accessibility guidelines that we work to, and they came out in 2014, and they're based on the WC3 consortium recommendations. So the Web Content Accessibility Guides 2.0 and 2.1 that came out earlier this year. And that's really about kind of making the, looking at the structure and navigation of websites and making sure they're accessible, that they work on different types of devices, and there's guidance there about making sure that adjustments are provided for so that students can understand the editorial content. So the examples there around video and audio, so we have transcripts and captions, video captions as standard now as well, and keyboard accessibility would be a standard in that. And we are increasingly looking at providing alternative formats as standard now as well, which I'll come on to in a second. And when producing these formal courses, we have testing processes that they go through as well. So make sure that they're screen readable, accessible, and also around colours and contrasts. And in addition to that, we can get bespoke testing done for us. This is, I mentioned about the standard adjustments that we provide. So this is a screenshot that's taken from one of our kind of formal fee-paying courses. But you can see there the range of different types of formats that content of that main website is available in. So students can study it online, or they can go and choose one of these various different downloads. So they can study it as an ebook or an interactive ebook, Kindles, PDFs, and we have Word versions that are optimized especially for screen readers as well. And there are places where they can now download the videos and audio, so they can have those in one place, and the transcripts to those if they want that in a format as well. So it gives the students a choice of being able to study online and offline in the different formats that will help make the material more accessible for them. And these kind of technical adjustments, as I say, these are increasingly more standardized now on modules, on new modules, and we are kind of mirroring this and following this through in our online free online courses. So this is a screenshot of our assistive technologies course, and you can see here, I think Andy was just pointing his little pen there around there. You can see in that bottom right hand corner are very similar formats to the ones we were just looking at in the more formal courses. So you've got the Word versions, the PDFs, the Kindles, and the EPUBs. I think it's fair to say that we've made a lot of progress on accessibility over the last few years in our formal courses, and this is starting to follow through in the MOOCs and other free online courses. And we're definitely, it's definitely a work in progress. So I think we are a lot more accessible with our free courses, but there is still a way to go to be fully compliant with W3C standards. And thinking about just what some of the design challenges are. I mean, those of you that were at Marilee's session yesterday talked about designing for MOOCs, and I think these are issues that we come across here for just more general issues, I guess, for designing for any online courses, and things that we encourage authors to think about when designing the courses. But certainly working at a screen can be an issue for students, and that's not just students that have accessibility problems. One of the areas that we've seen the biggest growth in for reasonable adjustments is requests for printed copies of online material. So I think it's something to be really mindful that working at screens can be problematic. Also, we know that students love to use interactives, and these can work very well online, and they can be a great way of effective way of learning. But they can raise lots of issues in terms of accessibility. So are your interactives, for example, accessible with screen readers? So it's always, again, something to be aware of when you're thinking about designing interactives. Collaborative activities, again, yesterday, I thought it was a very interesting conversation, Mary-Lee's discussion that we had about the design issues and tensions between students saying they want more collaborative activities, and then the difficulties to actually get them to engage in group work or teamwork or online collaborative activities as well. So there's a real kind of tension there, and collaborative activities can throw up all sorts of challenges. So, you know, not just in terms of accessibility, but we mentioned yesterday about synchronous and asynchronous working, and students that are living in different time zones. So yeah, all sorts of problems with collaborative activities. And a similar kind of issue with online tuition as well. And again, I think if you're using third-party materials or bespoke assets in your either formal course or the MOOCs, again, it's like thinking about have they been tested for accessibility, and what sort of challenges do they bring up? And one of the things that I do is kind of work with authors in once they're thinking about designing courses and in that production process to help them kind of address and accessibility right from the start. And I think one of the things I would say about promoting inclusion and accessibility is it's all about mindset. It's all about awareness and being aware of what the issues are and trying to address those as you design a new course. I think in the past, the OU definitely had an approach of designing and producing materials and then thinking about how they retrofit an adjustment to it afterwards. And that's not as effective. It's much more expensive. You know, much better if we can think about designing these courses to be accessible from the off. Not going to go into all these, but just, you know, if you're familiar with designing MOOCs, then you'll be familiar with best practice in design. But certainly things like if you know a teaching point is really important, then think about different ways of presenting that. So for example, if you've got a teaching point in a really complicated image or graph, then a figure description probably isn't going to capture that for somebody who can't see or interpret that graph. So try and get that teaching point across in another mode as well. So, you know, have an audio or have it as part of the teaching text as well. Language and culture, Andy touched on this at the beginning. And really, and again, Mary-Lee's talked about this yesterday in terms of different perspectives in different kind of locations or different cultures. I'm thinking of it much more in a kind of general term as to not use language. It's just to be very careful of your language and not use language that might alienate people. So, you know, avoid using idioms. Be very careful about the assumptions that you use. And a lot of these things are very obvious, but obviously often they get missed. Even as simple terms as thinking about instructions to students to go and read a particular thing, you know, kind of assumes that all students will be reading and some students won't, some students will be listening. So, you know, instead of using the word read, use the word study. Very, you know, obvious things that often get missed. the study chunks there, again, you'll be familiar with that in designing materials, but that's not just that, you know, it's something that benefits all students, but particularly thinking about students that study with fatigue or students that have mental health issues. So think about small sections and how you chunk the study up. And the media hopping here as well, that this very much came into OU Speak from when we had we still had blended courses between books and online materials. But I think it's also relevant in MOOCs as well, that if you are sending students out to look at links or look at videos or look at things outside the site, is it clear how they navigate back again? Again, a really obvious point, but something that does get that we don't always kind of get right. And again, another obvious one, but provide a glossary for students, because this will help if especially if if English is not their first language. And I think the main take-home point really is that it's about thinking about what's the best approach for all students. So this isn't about trying to stifle different approaches or stifling innovation. It's about thinking about what the best design is for the majority, and if that's not accessible, then how you know, how are you going to provide an alternative to achieve the same learning? And again, another obvious point, but inform students of that. So let students know in advance what the potential challenges would be and what you've done about it. And I work in a faculty now where we do actually have accessibility guides on all our modules, which is great. It's been real good progress that we've made in the last few years. But these are only available to students once they've registered on the module. So again, it's an issue that actually it's that kind of information students need to decide before they register to know if the module's for them. So that again raises up, you know, issues there about the level of detail we go into and how we communicate those messages. So this is my final slide, just to finish off. If it was an ideal world and some of the things I'd like to see. So I think we are certainly at the OU, we are developing our awareness of the needs of diverse learners, and we are starting to see that become more embedded in the kind of production process and the design process, but we still have got a way to go. And it's important, I think, like the point that I've just said, that authors don't feel that this is about stifling their openness or innovation. Institutions, you know, it's really important, as I've said, in developing that culture to have policies and guides for authors and technical developers. And as we're seeing more kind of online authoring tools becoming available, you know, that they have ways of building in accessibility prompts to you know, help guide authors in thinking about those as they're developing materials. And of course, as we all know, in an ideal world, the delivery platforms would be kind of fully accessible. And we've just finished off with a few references there, if you'd like to go and follow up anything on what we've been talking about. I hadn't been keeping an eye on the chat box, so I don't know. I see that there's some. I'll hand over to you, Andy, while I go and read those ones.
I just see that Darko's put one question or comment in there about moving to barriers to entry is one important issue, but guiding students' success in completing courses and degrees is perhaps more important. I think that highlights an interesting point, and again, it comes back to this contrast we have between the taught courses that for fee-paying students, they're registered, there are people, there are tutors, there are other people who can provide support and advice and guidance as the students are studying. Obviously for self-study MOOCs or even those cohort-based ones on Future Learn, there can be somebody available, but normally they're available for dealing with the subject matter of the MOOC, not with providing this additional support. So yes, you can only go so far with the design for learning in terms of making stuff accessible to people, but whether they will still complete a course and then complete a qualification, there are so many other factors that are at play there, which may have nothing to do with with the how well you've designed it. But it may be that some people do drop out of such courses because they have some accessibility issue which they can't overcome. Well, obviously, as I say, for one of our talk courses, if they make a request, we can do things during a presentation. We'll often can provide some specialist support for a student, particularly if a student's particular disabilities change within a study of a module or course, because there's some of their conditions don't always stay the same, so we can make adjustments and give personalized support as it goes. So yes, universal design for learning can only go so far. Are there any other questions? Because we're already taking up a long time. I don't see anybody typing, so I assume that we'll now be handing over to John.
So, yeah, thank you, Andy and Rachel, for this nice overview what accessibility and inclusiveness means, and also the special position of the Open University in the UK. John will talk about more the community part of MOOCs itself. John, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, you are fine, John. You are fine.
Okay, in that case, I'll start. Is that the thing to do? Make a start? Right. Okay, thanks very much. I'm very conscious this is probably the antidote to the previous presentation, in the sense that it's very much a almost individual work in progress, and it's probably driven by well, two things actually, which may help as an explanation. One was a kind of ongoing distress and dismay, maybe about the loss of some of the early idealism about MOOCs, and the way in which much or many of the MOOCs that we now see have moved away from the early pedagogy and ideology to something more maybe transmissive or corporate. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I just think the kind of ecology of MOOCs is becoming dominated by a particular way of thinking about them and delivering them. And so much of what I'm trying to do is redress that balance. And on a more positive note, much of what I've been trying to do is also driven by the experience of working with Inga de Waard and a team in some years ago now, something we called MOOC, and also by other projects that I've worked on subsequently of a more formal nature. So, for example, an FP7 project called Eagle, which was working with dispersed local government employees across Europe. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and as I say, this is very much a work in progress, and to some extent, probably quite a large extent, I'll be repeating in a more informal sense what I put in the report published recently by DTU that you might have seen, that summarises a lot of current thinking on MOOCs. And what I'm going to talk through now, I suppose, well, it's very much some of the pieces of an unfinished jigsaw, really. And what I'm trying to do is work from the experience of MOOC, which, for all I know, was incredibly successful but quite hit and miss, and work from a set of general principles, and that's easy, we've probably all got general principles, to something that is of practical use. And that's where I start to stumble and worry. But anyway, so what might be those bounded experience of being within inside one learning system or one learning technology, when in fact, you know, everyone's subsequent experience is they'll be in a world where it's all coming at them from left, right, and centre, good, bad, weird, and indifferent. And that in a sense leads on to the idea of digital literacy being an underlying principle. Our students, however much structure we give them, go into a world that will change and will be chaotic. And so digital literacy, I suppose, is the ability to survive and differentiate, critique, and flourish in that world. And so I think that to however little or however much, these are the kinds of principles that we ought to be building into pedagogy and into MOOCs, if they are to have a place in a really weird and confusing world of digital connectivity and digital abundance. So that's kind of what I abstract from what I've been doing in an attempt to see what it is that we can build on. And then a slightly different set of principles or approaches is just the reflection that, well, actually, when my students graduate, my university students graduate, I suspect the first thing they'll do is stop using Moodle, or stop using their LMS, or stop using Canvas or WebCT. And I'm very conscious of the effort that we put into training and funding people to get onto our systems, when in fact they're already highly confident, familiar with many of their own. And so looking at how can one build a MOOC that exploits, well, actually a mass of stuff that's free, but also a mass of stuff that people are confident, familiar, already using. How can we build on the momentum of that rather than disregarding it and starting with something of our own? Okay, so yeah, the other part of my set of principles is around that. How can we exploit what people feel confident with, what they're already doing? And you could argue that's also a kind of pedagogic principle. How can we build on what they know? Okay, so that, I mean, all of that's kind of apple pie and motherhood. Probably things we'd all like to be doing. We just have to figure out what they mean in practice. Okay, so that kind of the principles of where I'm coming from. The next bit then is, sorry, I'm just trying to drive the slides. What I'd regard as Inga's work as a pioneer was something we called MOOC, and I've written up the statistics of the number of people that participated and the length, the duration of the course, and so on and so on. I mean, just to my mind, as one of the people facilitating it, it was a blinding success. It was a blizzard of interaction. But I guess certainly, I don't know if Inga explicitly articulated this, but it certainly built on what are the free systems that we can use, that we can knit together, that people already access. And so it used WordPress, for example. It used Google Docs, you know, and so on and so on, and fitted those together in a way that there was a entry point that took you into all of these other various resources. And I guess by and large they were Web 2.0 resources, which I think is critical. They were Web 2.0 resources and enabled to people to create and comment. And I think Inga may have modified the structure slightly, and how one works with feedback and changes structure and content is clearly a challenge. But as I say, it was just a shining example for me of how, with relatively limited resources, and a massive amount of support and engagement, it was possible to do something really quite wonderful. So, and just to digress slightly to talk about Eagle, as I say, it was a FP7 project, but and one of the things I learned was that actually we could build in game mechanics. If we wanted people to learn by creating, and we wanted people to learn by critiquing, we ought to give them the technology not only to create, which is clearly very straightforward, but also to rate and critique and review stuff. So you could then create systems that were comparable to the ones in, I don't know, Goodreads, Amazon, or for example, where you can actually read reviews of, if you like, the products, but you can then also kind of calibrate the reviewers by looking at other things they've reviewed. And you can maybe build a sense of who is a knowledgeable member of the community, or who has particularly strong or uncompromising views, but actually how you can not only encourage creation and contribution, but also put that in a context which helps people, everyone involved, to learn from it. Again, I guess that was a kind of principle or an ideal that one would like to incorporate. So the next slide. Yeah. So what does the practice amount to? And I suppose what I've been trying to do over the last 3 years, in maybe something of a kind of random walk, is hold workshops in different countries, talking through, walking through some of the ideas and some of the, what I've been trying to develop are, you might call, heuristics, guidelines. But I've become very conscious of the kind of diversity of people, learners, communities, cultures. And so that actually is quite a challenge. I mean, to give you an example, I've done workshops in Palestine, Hong Kong, Sweden, South Africa. And if you start from a principle of wanting to build on people's expectations and experiences of learning, both in terms of pedagogy and in terms of technology or the media of learning, then these are really, really, really quite diverse. And many cultures and people are what we'd regard as quite traditional or conservative and quite appreciative of kind of didactic and transmissive approaches. So that, you know, and actually quite appreciative of printed books and face-to-face conversations. So yeah, I just have to recognize that that's part of the space we're working in. And maybe that one of my initial steps is to get groups to talk through the various constraints, you know, which might be infrastructure or access or accessibility, but the various technical, cultural, pedagogic constraints that in effect produce what I'd call the design space. You know, if there's just a range of things you can't do for reasons of technology or infrastructure, or a range of things you can't do because of people's prior experiences or expectations, then what you're left with as a designer of education, if you like, is the design space where you actually can make choices that you can put into practice, as opposed to having ideas that you can't. And I think before going any further with any particular target group, the first principle is to try and identify all of the different dimensions of that design space, which might also include the curriculum, the legacy, the resources, you know, how much time, effort, expertise have you got to put into this thing, to maintain this thing, to monitor this thing. You know, that's another constituent of the design space. And it might turn out actually that that leaves you with very, very little freedom of choice, freedom of movement to actually make decisions about how you do things. But it's the kind of point of departure. Until you know how much freedom you've got, you can't really exercise it. And so, I'm sorry, have I moved on to this? Sorry, that's it. And I've then tried to work kind of top down, decomposing how would you design what I'm calling a community MOOC into a number of separate heuristics that allow you to tackle the problem in a more structured way. And so I think these are the key areas or key topics that anyone needs to address. Maybe there's one or two more, maybe not. So for example, when I say curating content, I'm talking about what content you want yourself as the educator and then your learners as they take over the responsibility. What are the heuristics for incorporating content into the MOOC for everyone to learn from? And I guess it's essentially, in a sense, trying to identify what is the metadata for that content. And I think, well, you could argue that's very comparable to the kind of metadata one might use for OER, but that may be way too complex, way too technical, way too elaborate, and you need something quicker and dirtier. But actually, you might need to add in other issues as well, like what is the culture from which the content is coming, and how good a match is it to the culture of your learners, or how specific or generic is it, how transferable is it? When I say look back period, what might be how stale could it be? So this is partly, if you like, a set of heuristics for saying how could you incorporate content into your MOOC, but it's then also heuristics that you could pass on to your learners so they begin to curate the content rather than the educator, so that it becomes, if you like, a living community of content, but also so that you're handing over the expertise of curating, of taking this forward in their lives, if you like, as lifelong learners, as well as just a technique for maintaining the content of the MOOC in question. And I suppose what I've said about content, I'm hoping is in a sense transferable to communities, because I think they're an equally valuable but undervalued part of the resources from which our learners could learn. And I suppose, you know, if one was asking what does open mean, it might mean accessing other content, but it might also mean accessing other communities. And I worry, certainly in formal higher education, that that's actually exactly what we're not doing. You know, we're building a paywall around our content, and we're building a paywall around our communities. Whereas in fact, you know, you only have to look at Facebook, for example, to see, or Twitter in a different sense, to see all sorts of stable, unstable, transient communities of people discussing stuff, sharing stuff. And so should we be enabling our learners to join those communities outside the domain of our MOOC, to give them a richer experience, to widen their horizons? And if so, how would we curate those communities? If you like, what is the metadata of a community? So these kind of questions that I've identified here might be the kind of metadata questions you could ask about a community. You know, if you happen to find something on Facebook, you know, ornithology, Byzantine history, how big is it? How active? How stable? How formal? How, I don't know, polemical or factual is it? And again, maybe this helps people crystallize their own judgment about being involved in, if you like, real life, non-educational communities of learners. So yeah, that's the idea of curating communities as well as curating content. So I'm not sure how long I've got. I made a note somewhere and then lost it.
You still have time, Sean.
Okay, thank you. And then the idea of building participation, which I suppose means partly the transition from lurking to creation. And here I mention this idea about rating and reviewing, how to give feedback to become a critical member of the community, to build on people's experience of using Amazon, TripAdvisor, Wikipedia, iTunes, Goodreads, and so on, so that not only can they learn by creating, but they can learn by critiquing. Although I guess that involves the first point, establishing some ground rules about etiquette, so that, I don't know, you criticize the creation, not the creator, for example. And recognize what I suppose as educationalists we'd see as the attractive, desirable progression from being someone peripherally involved and consuming our content and maybe needing structure, to becoming a more expert participant, creating content and structure. And actually, if you like, being the graduate of our MOOCs who can go back into the world or the rest of their lives as lifelong learners with those kinds of skills. And I realized at that point I was talking about things in the same way that I think I'd seen Gilly Salmon talk and write about these kinds of issues. Well, when would it have been? 25 years ago? Maybe not quite so much. In her description of what she called e-moderating. And I think this obviously evolved in her work in the Open University, but it was of the UK, but it was a reaction or a response to the fact that when the OU went online, or when students first went online, there was a kind of dependency on the tutor, that any query or question or uncertainty would be electronically channeled at the tutor, and her objective was actually to turn, if you like, a dependent community of online learners into an independent, self-sustaining community of learners from whom the tutor could abstract themselves, that this would have a life of its own. And this is her, I have to count them now, 1, 2, 3, 5 steps. Okay, her 5 steps of moderating or e-moderating. That might well be a starting point for the heuristics that would work within any given online community. And I'm very conscious, as I say, that working in different cultures like the Middle East or Southern or Eastern Africa, that how this would play out would be very, very different. And maybe even our aspirations about whether it even should play out would be very, very different. But nevertheless, certainly in terms of Western liberal education, this would seem to be a desirable outcome, producing an independent, self-actuating community of learners. And then finally, for today, I was very conscious that when we had done some of this, for example, within the Eagle project, that, we had, if you like, if nothing else, lots of money to spend on the development of technology, and clearly that's not the way I'd see as attractive, and not the way that most educators can go. So I just try to make a list, which encouragingly just gets longer and longer and longer, about technologies that would actually then, if you like, operationalize these various activities, educational activities. So, for example, recently, I'm not sure if I'm kind of appropriating or co-opting some of them, but I spotted EasyChair and then thought, oh, that would be good, wouldn't it? You could actually critique each other's contributions by using EasyChair. It's free. So as a tool for peer review and rating and reacting, oh, well, there's an EasyChair. And then you've got, as I say, all of these other different categories that you can use for coordination or contribution or creation or organization or communication. And in a sense, I'm conscious I'm still nibbling at the edges of my challenge, of this problem. How do you then actually design the MOOC? And actually, I realize that this might sound like a cop-out, but I think one of my one of my other principles was actually in a world of rapid change, the best you can hope for is to do something quick and dirty that gets feedback quickly, that actually you get it out there, you get it amongst the people you want to work with, and then you listen to what they say in the hope that the first iteration may not be brilliant, but the second one will be better, and just hope to move forward on the basis of those kinds of, well, of the learners taking as much ownership as possible, and of the facilitator merely facilitating the growth and design. So on that incredibly optimistic and upbeat but rather vague note, I'll stop and wait for anyone's reactions.
Thank you very much, Jan. So all participants are able to post a question in the chat itself. I already had the liberation to post a question for you, John. You, in the last slide, presented a nice overview of existing tools, so existing tools that could be used instead of a learning management system or even a MOOC platform. Could you also do that by connecting to existing communities? So provide an overview of existing community of practice that could be connected to learning and our educational efforts. So not only the tools, but also connecting to active community of practice on certain themes and topics that we should embrace in our education.
Yes, I think so. I mean, primarily I'm reacting against what I see as the kind of closedness of, well, for example, the universities I work in and the business model that underpins them, and actually recognizing in a different sense the opportunities that are out there in the open. And you've described one, and I've described two or three others. So I think there is no inherent kind of inhibition or prohibition about exploiting whatever's out there, because that's the world our learners spend their lives in anyway. So yeah, go for it.
For the other participants, we had on Tuesday a presentation for MOOCs for the world of business, and the person presented today was Chris from University of Applied Sciences in Graz, and he was surprised by the power of the cloud and all the ideas he get on entrepreneurship for business, and that he used that kind of connection to the outside cloud world in his day-to-day lecture at the university. So
and that may be something we've lost in how MOOCs are now, I don't know, designed or operated. That, as I understand it, you know, the initial pedagogy was around exploiting the wisdom of the crowd and the participants, and creating something that was relatively flat and participative. And now we have something which is far more kind of centralized and controlled. So maybe in a sense, well, when I say back to basics, that's one of the basics I'd quite like to get back to.
That kind of example of Tuesday was indeed not the standardized way MOOC platforms or MOOCs are designed, but more getting all people involved, and they had 3,000 participants, and with all the ideas they had, etc. And then it's about how to moderate that and how to give energy back to that kind of community and use that also in your on-campus education. So that gives a lot of issues in addition, but it gives a lot of energy as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yes, I agree. And in many respects, trying to hand as much of the MOOC over to the learners as possible. I mean, I was very conscious, for example, in the Moby MOOC experience, but in others that I've worked with like Stanford, for example, how there is clearly a downside that we have some responsibility to recognize, and that was that people without the sufficient educational background could quite easily sink without a trace in the course of this kind of blizzard of contributions. And yeah, we have to recognize that, even if we can't do anything about it, that if you don't come with the appropriate intellectual and digital background, then this might be a very confusing, bewildering, unsettling, and demoralizing experience. But But yeah, first of all, we need to recognise that that's going on and figure out how to address it.
Perhaps others have questions as well. I saw someone typing but not finishing. So now, thank you, John. It's very nice to have that kind of view and that kind of perspective as well. And I think that like in teaching, it is about variation. It's not about one approach. So I think that the most standardized MOOCs do have an additional value. But what you are saying is that it's more structural to connect with existing tools and existing outside communities. We should incorporate both in regular education and in MOOCs.
Yeah, I think apart from anything else, I might be just admittedly arguing from one corner of the MOOC ecology, but arguing for a continued kind of diversity of how we do things and what we call MOOCs and how we design them.
Yeah. So let's decide that the UK will stay in Europe, so we have diversity there. Yeah. There's a question in the chat, John, from Mosen. If you can read it, I can spell it out for you. It's MOOCs have evolved in many ways since the emerge from the community-based concepts on connectives approach to a more commercialized instructional Coursera style like MOOCs. So how would you see the current and future situation on MOOCs in formal education, mainly based for campus-based education?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's either an educational question or a technical question, as opposed to a commercial, political, economic, or organisational question, if you see what I mean. And clearly, whichever of those it might be, they play out differently in different countries, in different part of the sector. And I'd certainly worry in the UK that the formal campus-based education sector is in a state of economic and political uncertainty, volatility. I mean, that's certainly true of the UK, and that uncertainty, of which Brexit is only a small part, that uncertainty is making for a certain amount of aversion to risk or change, and a certain amount of conservatism, and also a lot of weight being put into the kind of financial, economic, and business arguments for why we do things. I don't think higher education in the UK is in a good state. And if you start from that and then ask what the role of MOOCs is within that, it's quite problematic. And I suppose actually there seems to have been a considerable discrepancy between the amount of attention that MOOCs get and the business case for it. Looking at MOOCs from a manager's perspective, it's not quite clear why we're doing all of this. It can't be just because we're generous, surely. So that might sound like an evasive answer, but I'm just trying to flesh out the various factors at work. And that's only a kind of very high bandwidth, high GDP kind of answer. If you look at the rest of the world, I'm sure the answer will be very, very different. But certainly the kind of increasing corporatization of higher education globally means that we're all competing for all of each other's markets. And MOOCs seem to be a way in which that happens, although it's rather difficult to see how it happens if no money changes hands. Sorry, I'm bewildered. I wish I knew the answer to this question.
Oh, yes, indeed, it depends also on different continents and countries where there is governmental involvement or not, or where there is more business-driven approach.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I think some while ago I looked at a MOOC being developed by the University of Cape Town, and was very struck by the fact that even I could think of what might be culturally and technically and infrastructurally appropriate for the kind of MOOC ideology to take root across Africa. And what the University of Cape Town were doing was exactly not that. That they wanted to compete on the global stage amongst all the other global players. So part of what I'm asking for is a kind of diversity that would allow the MOOC idea to reach different groups of people in different conditions and cultures and countries. I still feel that many cultures and countries are being neglected by this phenomenon.
I think that he is, Mosen is still typing a question. But yeah, even in India and China, where there are successful MOOC platforms itself, it can be both charity, so to give inclusiveness, to access to people, to higher education. But it can also be in competition for the global market and to keep their students in India and China in this international education.
Well, and you have to ask, I mean, as with most educational technology, or in fact most digital technology, how does it skew the balance between different languages and cultures? So, I'd imagine the majority of MOOCs take place in American English using American digital technology, probably, which is quite nice in terms of allowing different communities to engage in the, information superhighway or the global knowledge economy. But if you speak, Welsh or Swahili or Swana or lots of other minority languages, things don't look so good.
Yeah, unless if you are in a big country like India or China, but not a small country.
Okay. Yeah, but India has a mass of different dialects and languages as well. And I'm not sure if ability in English on the Indian subcontinent may have a kind of socio-economic bias as well. That actually, if you're middle class and educated, then you can access an English MOOC.
Yeah.
But if you're not, then you can't. That's my guess.
Yeah. Andy is pinpointing to a project trying to devise MOOCs for specific audience. So there's a link there. Also to online course of refugees. John and I are also in a project called Moonlight, addressing the same issue on MOOCs for refugees. So Jonathan is mentioning learning how to learn from Coursera, and that it has been translated by the community of students into different languages. Again, a community effort based on a standardized English MOOC itself. So therefore, their community's efforts are seen as well. In the Open Ed Trend report, where I mentioned the URL earlier, John produced a paper, but there's also a paper by Gabi Withaus and Alistair Creeman, where he addresses these issues as well.
Yeah, I think the issue of language, focusing on language risks oversimplifying the issue in the sense that we might merely be translating an English original into some target language, but not recognizing fully how different cultures have different ideas about pedagogy as well as different languages. So my sense would be we still have to kind of unpack that a bit and think what it might mean. I mean, maybe we're lucky that many other cultures have much more transmission-based, content-based, broadcast-based ideas of education anyway, so that kind of makes it easier for us, because I'm sure it's that kind of thing scales up in the way that discussion maybe doesn't. And I certainly look at kids in Palestinian schools, and it is a very much teacher at the front didactic presentation that forms the basis of Arab MOOC learners, 15 years, 10 years later. I'm having trouble reading. Oh, sorry, yes, I'm reading the penultimate. Yes, sorry. Goal is not yet fulfilled. Yeah, absolutely, quite, yes. And maybe it never will be. Maybe that's just what education's about, unfulfilled goals.